Orbital Gardens, this is Mission Control. We are confirming acquisition of your signal. You are live in 5, 4, 3, 2.
Hello and welcome to Gardeners of the Galaxy, the podcast for all of the sentient beings in the universe who have a passion for plants. I am Emma the Space Gardener and I will be your host as we explore gardening on Earth and beyond. There are plenty of extreme environments on Earth where plants survive and even thrive, and learning more about them could one day help us grow plants in space and on the Moon or Mars. As a senior research assistant in botany at the Canadian Museum of Nature and a member of the Arctic Flora of Canada and Alaska project, Paul Sokoloff is very involved in cataloguing plant and lichen biodiversity in the Arctic and beyond. He's also a sci-fi fan. You may have seen his video exploring how plants appear in space films and TV shows. If you haven't, it's fun to watch and I'll put that link in the show notes for you. And he's also an analogue astronaut who has participated in multiple biological expeditions at the Mars Desert Research Station. I'm thrilled that Paul is able to join us as our mission specialist for this episode, talking about his botanical adventures on Earth and on simulated Mars. Hi Paul, welcome to Gardeners of the Galaxy. It's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me today, Emma.
I'm really excited about this conversation because you and I share a love of sci-fi space plants, which is how I found out about your existence. So I think that'll probably creep in somewhere, don't you?
I suspect so. I always talk about space or plants or some of that intersection there whenever I talk to anyone, so definitely.
Fantastic. Okay, so if we stay here on Earth to begin with, I mean, you're no stranger to growing plants in extreme environments. So can you tell us about your experiences, about what it's like cataloguing plants in the Arctic?
Absolutely. So I'm very fortunate to work as a botanist at the Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa, Ontario. And I've been here for about 15 years, which is scary.
Yeah.
I don't know where the time goes. It sneaks up on you. And for most of that time, I've been really fortunate to do a lot of botanical work in and around the Canadian Arctic. So this is, when you're thinking of the tundra, many people think of, snow and ice, and it is many of those things for a large part of the year. But in the summer, in those beautiful months of July and August, it is just a fantastically lush environment. You can find all sorts of different microhabitats with different plants that grow uniquely in this Arctic environment because they're adapted to grow in this short, cold growing season. And it's a real privilege to be able to work up there. We call it Inuit Nunangat. This is the Inuit homeland. Inuit have lived on these lands since time immemorial. And to be able to go up and to work in communities and out on the land on these really fascinating plants is not what I thought I would be doing with my career, but is actually a dream come true.
I bet it is. I have a quote that I took from one of your bios, and it says, "On any given day, Paul may be in a faraway place doing fieldwork, in the museum's herbarium studying specimens, or taking part in outreach activities on behalf of the museum. In the quest for science, he's had his clothes stolen in southern Labrador, flipped over a canoe full of samples in New Brunswick's, I'm going to say Jackay River, and hiked to the top of McGill Mountain on Ellesmere Island wearing rubber boots." Now, to me, this sounds like you're the kind of botanical version of Indiana Jones.
I actually think it's really interesting. Indiana Jones worked for a museum. I work for a museum. And honestly, it's an adventure. To be able to roll with things as they come up, I think is important in botany.
Yeah.
I think it's important in space stuff too. We see this all the time. We just had 2 astronauts return from a extended 9-month mission to the International Space Station.
Yeah.
So I don't know. You just kind of have to have fun with it along the way.
Yeah.
I feel fortunate that,
Yeah.
that we got the samples back from the canoe. That's what matters.
It's okay, everybody. The plants were fine. Okay, so you're clearly an active person who enjoys being outside in nature. But what made you decide to get into botany?
Actually, I came about it a little
Oh,
sideways.
good.
When I was, a younger person trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, I decided that I wanted to be a science writer. I always loved science journalists on the CBC, the Canadian
Ah,
Broadcasting
cool.
Corporation, huge fan. And actually, I think it was folks like Jay Ingram and Ivan Semenek. These are some really interesting Canadian science journalists that made me want to follow that passion.
Right.
So I applied to Carleton University here in Ottawa for journalism, and I may or may not have been kicked out of my program for um, my grades, which happens.
It does.
Um,
Yeah.
and I realized at that moment that uh, you can have a few different passions.
You
And
can.
I walked by the greenhouses at Carleton a lot, and I always wanted to know what was going on there. And that was a kind of an early hint for me that maybe this is where I want to be going. And so I switched into biology with a big focus on plants. And it turns out I loved it. I've always liked going outdoors. I've done this with my family as long as I can remember. So it turned into something that, wasn't the first plan, but is certainly what I'm happy I ended up doing.
That sounds fantastic, actually. I think that's a good thing for people to hear that it doesn't always have to be your plan goes right 100% of the time because you will end up somewhere good.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We have these crises in life, but life carries on afterwards. And you're obviously having fun with it, so that's awesome.
I have to say, like, I can't imagine having a different kind of job. I've been doing this for a long time, and I hope to do it for a long time to come.
Awesome. Okay, so we've got the botany. Where does your interest in space come from?
Well, you mentioned at the very beginning that we share a deep love of sci-fi, and this is
Yes.
true. As long as I can remember, I have loved science fiction. I would read, I think I was reading Dune when I was 14, up late at night.
Yeah.
Different Paul, but, and, I don't want to go down that path either, because but I think I always, what was it that introduced it? It was Star Trek. It was Star
Yes.
Trek: The Next Generation. It
Yes.
was what keyed me into it. And I guess I didn't realize until years later that Keiko O'Brien was an early botanical role model for me, plants in space,
Yeah.
right? So I've always loved that. That's always been something that I've really been passionate about. And so about, over 12 years ago now, the Mars Society in the States, who operate two Mars analog sites. These are stations where you can live and work as if you're exploring the surface of Mars.
Uh huh.
They were looking for crew members, and I thought, well, this sounds fun. I threw my name in the ring, and I got an email from them. They said, hey, yes, we would love for you to come. Please pitch us a research program. Come on down. And that actually started a very long collaboration with the Mars Society and with Dr. Shannon Rupert, who used to be the director of analog research there and is still a dear friend of mine. We've been working together for a long time on these projects.
Okay, so how many times have you been on the surface of Mars, shall we say?
Uh, so I've actually only ever done one simulated mission there.
Okay.
So, and that's the the full mission where
Yeah.
you wear the spacesuit every time you leave the hab.
Really
You
immersive. Yeah.
decompress, absolutely, and you're kind of in that psychological space where you're by yourself on the red planet, and it was really great. I did realize afterwards that, I don't know if I'd be a very good Martian astronaut because I like being outdoors way too
Yes.
much.
Yes.
So that was also, you learn stuff about yourself continually, right?
Yeah.
But Shannon and I got together and we thought, well, there's still a lot of work to be done here, and the station is a great opportunity to understand the biodiversity of this unique analog. Because the better we understand the how the analog works, the better we can inform future analog missions at this station.
Yeah.
And so I was there four more times, not in simulation, but using the station as essentially a base camp for exploring the area around and figuring out what kind of life grows in these deserts.
And what kind of life does grow in these deserts?
There are some fascinating plants that grow there. Plants that are adapted to grow in nutrient poor soils,
Yeah.
plants that grow without a lot of moisture. plants that have thick hairs that insulate them from drying out, but also keep them warm in the cold desert nights because it does get quite cold in the desert at night. So just all sorts of unique organisms that I'm pretty passionate about.
Is it very different to what you might find in the Arctic?
It's different in some ways, and then in some ways it's similar. Many plants in the Arctic have similar adaptations because the Arctic is also relatively nutrient poor, does not get a lot of precipitation outside of the snow it receives,
Yeah.
and has harsh UV light throughout the polar summer because the sun doesn't set while many of these plants are growing. So there's not a lot of species that are shared between the environments, but there are a lot of similarities in how they've evolved.
It sounds like both of those environments might have some good candidates for maybe taking into space one day.
I think so, and I think there's actually a few that are personal favorites, including one that I picked because you mentioned that you ask a specific question to every
I
guest.
did. We'll come on to that in a minute. So, at this point, I tend to ask people whether they would like to go into space. And you kind of said that you maybe wouldn't want to go to Mars. But if you had the chance to go into space, would you like to?
Without hesitation.
Yeah.
I think it would be fascinating to experience. And I mean, I think I would go to Mars. I would always want to return to
Yeah.
Earth.
Yeah.
And I think I think maybe as I've gotten a little older, I've kind of come to appreciate our planet
Yeah.
in a deeper way. But there's a really great Kim Stanley Robinson quote. So Kim Stanley Robinson wrote the Mars trilogy, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, about colonizing Mars. And later on in his writing, I think he said that, he always thought it was important to keep in mind that while here on Earth, we can boldly go, but we can boldly stay.
Yeah.
And I think that's really cool. Like, I would always want to come back to this really important planet of ours.
I think if you spent any time on Mars and then you came back at the point at which you could see the Earth from the windows again on the spacecraft and the color, and just knowing how much life is here, that was going to be an overwhelming experience. You should be like so homesick at that point when you've still got maybe 3 months
I
to
do
go.
think so.
Okay, so we have you going into space on a long duration space mission. So all your food needs are met. And any research projects you want to take with you are met. You have room in your luggage for a plant, your personal pet plant, to keep you company. What species do you choose and why? I've got a feeling you've got a good answer.
Well, I mean, I have one that I think would be, it's a deep favorite of mine. So it's, the Latin name is Oxaria digina, mountain sorrel in English.
Right.
And this is a plant that grows across the Arctic and down into the Rocky Mountains here in Canada and down into the US. And it may actually grow, it may be circumpolar, but don't quote me on that. And this plant has been important to Inuit because it is chock full of vitamin C.
Yeah.
So you actually can pick the leaves and chew on it, and it's this like sour, tasty treat that is wonderful when you're on the tundra. So I think this would be a great plant to bring with us because a little bit of Inuit ingenuity as we're traveling in space, I think would go a very long way. And I mean, vitamin C is important to us.
It is, and NASA is very worried about the fact that they can't keep the vitamins in the food long enough to get people to Mars and back. So yeah, they're going to need to have some sort of fresh vitamins at some point during their trip. So it sounds like Does it have a common name? So you did say, didn't you?
So mountain sorrel,
Mountain sorrel.
and in Inuktitut it's kungali, which unfortunately my Inuktitut pronunciation is not as good as it should be. So if you have any Inuk listeners, I apologize. But I also think it's a really beautiful plant. It's got these red stems. It's in the same family as rhubarb, so it's got vitamins, but also it's just beautiful to look at.
Oh, that sounds fantastic. Okay, so going back to the sci-fi, you mentioned Kim Stanley Robinson. You mentioned Star Trek. Have you got a favourite representation of plants in space?
Oh,
If you had to pick
that's
one.
a fantastic question. Because in Dune they do have there's a botany aspect to it, right?
It's a long time since I've read Dune, and I can't remember. I'll have to have another look.
They have they have these botanical testing stations that the Fremen use as initial hideouts, and so I think that's really interesting because desert botany is obviously something I love.
Yeah.
I have to say though, I just oh, you know what? The movie Sunshine. Did you ever see that
I
one with
have seen
Danny?
Sunshine. Yes, that
Yeah,
spaceship is just like the best thing ever, isn't it?
exactly. It's beautiful. It's somewhat realistic, and Michelle Yeoh as a space botanist. I mean, that I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably up there. I don't know if I can pick just one representation of
You
plants
can,
in
you
space, you
can have
know?
an all.
I just, anytime it's there, I mean, even in Farscape, they have sentient plants. So,
Yeah.
um, I don't know. Plants are, you can tell I'm deeply passionate about this.
Yeah, me too. And I think it'll be exciting if we ever find life somewhere else in the universe to see what the plants look like.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And actually,
Yeah.
I mean, an interesting question that I've just thought of is, yeah, on Earth there's this distinction between animals and plants. Would that necessarily be the case on another planet that's evolved completely separately? Could you have like animal-plant hybrids?
I mean, I think, these are names that we use because they're easy for us,
Yeah.
right? We developed this classification that works within our paradigm of evolution. It may or may not be true depending on where you look in the universe. I think there are certain physical constraints that means that certain types of life will always evolve.
Yeah.
But, and, I'm not an astrobiologist, so, take that with a grain of salt. But, as a taxonomist, what we often say is, what makes a species a species? And the flippant answer that I often hear is a species is anything a trained taxonomist tells you is a species.
Ooh.
And that tells you essentially that these are just
There you go.
terms that we use because they're convenient for us in the
Yeah.
classification of life. And there are different taxonomies too, in Inuktitut, in English, in French, and in Latin, there are different ways we refer to things. So if we looked outwardly, I think we'd have to really reevaluate how we classify organisms.
Well, that's an interesting thought to leave it on, I think. It's getting a bit philosophical now, isn't it?
Very.
It has been lovely having you on the show today, Paul. You've been an absolute dream of a guest.
Oh, it has been my pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you for this amazing podcast.
Oh, thank
Plants
you.
in Space. I mean, come on. How much cooler can it get?
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Paul for coming on the show to talk about his amazing botany adventures. I'll include the links to find out more about his work in the show notes, which you'll find on the website at spacebotany.uk. Don't forget that you can also sign up to the Gardens of the Galaxy newsletter for new episode alerts and bonus astrobotany content. That's it for this episode, so I will hand you back to Mission Control. Capcom, all this talk about sci-fi has got me in the mood for a movie. What's on my playlist this evening?
Orbital Gardens, this is Mission Control. We are confirming termination of your signal. Unfortunately, we have also lost your movie requests, so we have picked you The Martian and Frozen. Uplink commencing now. Mission Control out.